Hello, and thanks for tuning into our video workshop, where you'll learn more about the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses without employees. My name is Blessy Thomas, and I am the project director for the MBDA Care Center here in Philadelphia, which is operated by the Enterprise Center. The purpose of the center is to provide training, education, and advice to businesses in terms of recovery from the impact of COVID-19 and the resulting business restrictions and shutdowns. In this video, we'll cover three primary areas of focus. First, we'll review the statutes and regulations related to PPP. Second, we'll walk you through the application, key fields to complete, and backup documentation to provide with the application. And third, we're going to go over important deadlines and other critical information. Let's start with some context. Through June of 2020, more than 4.8 million PPP loans were approved, valued at $521.5 billion, which were processed through 5,461 lenders. Approximately 90% of loans and 95% of the funding went through banks. Almost 18% of the loans and 22% of the funding went to economically distressed areas. We know during 2020's PPP rounds, many small businesses, especially businesses owned by underrepresented groups, were left out. This may have been due to challenges such as lack of banking relationships, lack of resources to produce documentation in a timely manner, which is challenging as this loan is on a first-come, first-served basis, or perhaps because businesses did not access the full allowable funding amount due to lack of understanding on how to calculate the loan amount. Therefore, it is critical to provide this kind of training, service, and support this time around. We want as many small businesses as possible that are eligible to apply for PPP to access the funding so that businesses can sustain and are better positioned for long-term growth. At this time, I'll turn it over to Andrew Budrejka and the Morgan Lewis team to kick off our workshop today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Budrejka. I'm a partner with Morgan Lewis, which is a law firm in the city of Philadelphia. Pleasure to be with you here today to talk to you about this next round of the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses like you that do not have any employees. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues and teammates, Jamal Hill, Ben Stango, and Scott Berman. And the purpose of our presentation today is to help you understand this program generally, and then to the extent you're eligible, improve your access and prepare you to apply for the program. We will have a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. So we, again, encourage you to submit your questions in the chat. The Enterprise Center team is actually answering many of those questions real time in the chat, so they may be able to knock some of those out for you quickly. But we will take stock of all the questions and the real areas of concern during the presentation, and then we'll spend a good 20 or so minutes at the end talking about those questions. Next slide, Scott. So just a bit about Morgan Lewis. As I said, we're a global law firm with a big Philadelphia presence. We have been tracking the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on businesses and small businesses since the spring of last year. The four of us all serve on a task force at Morgan Lewis, specifically focusing on the Paycheck Protection Program and the other federal government, state government relief programs that have been rolled out in the past 9 or 10 months. So we have a lot of familiarity and knowledge, and we really are looking forward to helping you with this specific program today. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jamal to walk you through the program itself. Take it away, Jamal.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. So we'll just start with some background about how we got here. So as you all may know, the CARES Act, which was passed last March, provided for the initial Paycheck Protection Loan Program. And it's being revived as a result of the new act that was passed last December, which provided $900 billion to go towards pandemic relief, and approximately 285 billion of that, 900 billion, is dedicated to the extension and expansion of the PPP program. So this new, $285 billion strengthens the program for first and second time borrowers and extends the lifetime of the program through March 31st of this year. So this new iteration of the program is designed to specifically target, smaller and minority-owned businesses. We want to make them a priority, as was alluded to earlier. So $15 billion of the money is allocated to community lenders and small depository lenders for initial PPP loans, as well as the second draw. $35 billion are earmarked for first-time borrowers, and $15 billion of that 35 billion is allocated to smaller first-time borrowers with fewer employees, or for loans that are less than $250,000 in low-income areas. $25 billion is allocated to the second draw loans with smaller borrowers with that same threshold of 10 employees or fewer, and also loans of less than $250,000. So, the new iteration of the program opened this past Monday only for community financial institutions, and eligible lenders with assets of $1 billion or less are eligible starting today. So the program is going to be open to all eligible lenders starting next Tuesday, and that allows lenders of all sizes to make first or second draw loan requests. And we note that, as with the first iteration of the program, the loans are available on a first come, first served basis. So this is just a chart we have that compares some details for the first draw versus the second draw loans. Not relevant for you guys' purposes here, but we note that the threshold of employees is 500 for the first draw and 300 for second draw. The affiliation rules apply for both iterations of the program, and we'll delve more deeply into the affiliation rules a bit later in the presentation. So for second draw loans, you have to have used or plan to use the full amount of the original PPP loan that you received, and you have to also exhibit a 25% reduction in revenue, at least a 25% reduction in revenue in the first, second, third, or fourth quarter of 2020 relative to the corresponding quarter of 2019. So the maximum loan amount for the first draw loans is $10 million. If you're getting a second draw, the maximum is $2 million. In both cases, the forgiveness that you receive is non-taxable, and business expenses that are paid with the loan, paid through use of the loan funds, are also tax deductible in both cases. So to receive forgiveness, you must, in both cases, you must have used 60% towards payroll costs, and 40% must be used towards non-payroll costs. So again, just detailing the first time PPP loans, if you are seeking your loan for a PPP loan for the first time, the maximum is $10 million with a 1% interest rate. And so your actual loan amount would be the lesser of that $10 million and 2.5 times the borrower's average monthly payroll for the past 12 months. It excludes any compensation for employees that make over $100,000. And the SBA is guaranteeing 100% of the issued loans period of February 15th of last year through March 31 of this year. And so these are examples of what the loan proceeds can actually cover. It's a non-exhaustive list, but these are some good examples, that good guidance to use for you. So again, we just want to highlight that this is a potentially 100% forgivable loan, as long as you spend at least 60% of the PPP loan on payroll costs over a time period of your choosing, which is called the covered period, between 8 and 24 weeks. and the remaining 40% or less of the PPP funds still must be allocated towards allowable expenses during that same 8 to 24-week period. Now, the amount of loan forgiveness you receive will be reduced if greater than 40% of your loan amount is used towards non-payroll costs. If you've reduced your head count in any amount, or if you reduced your salaries by an amount that's greater than 25%. Okay, and now I want to hand it over to my colleague, Ben Stengo, who will talk in more detail about the actual application.
Thanks very much, Jamal, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. So as Jamal mentioned, I'm going to be getting into some of the more granular aspects of applying for the PPP. We're going to be taking a look at the actual application itself, so spending a little time there to understand what's going to be required and what type of information and documentation you should prepare in advance. And then following my portion of the presentation, Scott's going to return and he will be speaking through exactly how you complete some of these calculations geared towards all of you businesses without employees. We might throw an example there of a business with some employees, just in case there are folks with that situation on the presentation today. So first, you apply for the PPP loan through an authorized SBA lender. The Enterprise Center is absolutely an authorized lender, so that's a great place to turn. There is a large database of PPP eligible lenders on the Small Business Administration's website. So if you're looking for a lender, you can look there as a resource. Generally, however, we'll want to suggest that you consider working with a lender where you already have a relationship. That's important because there are some hurdles to creating a new client relationship with a lender in terms of providing documentation and information. So if you already have that lending relationship, it might speed up the process for being able to participate in the program. I'll also note that when it comes to working with lenders, a key thing to keep in mind is that this program is ever changing and evolving. There's lots of information that comes down the pike from the Small Business Administration, from the Department of Treasury, that feeds into the general public for sure, but often also directly to lenders. So you definitely want to find a lender to work with who will be a partner, who you can engage with, ask questions, get this really critical information directly from them. That's a really important consideration when it comes to applying for this program. Next slide, please. So let's talk about eligibility. Generally, folks on this call are eligible for this program based on the strict initial standards of size, sole proprietors, independent contractors, self-employed employees, 501c3s are eligible. So we're imagining that most of the folks joining us today are small businesses who qualify here. As we get into the application, we'll note some specific qualities of eligibility that kind of build on these initial size standards that might make you ineligible for the program. Rare cases, we hope they don't apply, but that's possible. And additionally, there are some types of businesses that are categorically ineligible. There's a fulsome list of those businesses that are categorically ineligible through the Small Business Administration. We at Morgan Lewis have links to that on our publications available on our website. So that's something that you should take a look at. It includes businesses like lenders. It includes a wide array, so that's really why it's important to take a look at that list, because we're talking as far as private clubs, pawn shops. There's a whole host of seemingly random, but surely there was intent behind the list of businesses that are categorically ineligible. We're taking a look there to make sure you don't fall into one of those buckets. The one I'll mention, which might apply to some folks, is a business that only holds real estate. That type of business is ineligible. Let's move to the next slide and get into the meat of the application. So here before you, you see the PPP application in all of its glory. 2 pages, a lot of straightforward information seemingly, but we want to make sure that everybody on this call, on this presentation, has a good grasp of not only how do you get to the answers in this application, but how do you get comfortable with some of the yes/no questions, and what type of documentation do you need to bring to the table. So first, looking at the very top, basic information, business name, type, address, etc. This just leads me to say that it's really important to have on hand the documentation backing up this type of information. Your formation documents with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the state of Delaware, wherever you happen to form your business. Tax documentation showing your EIN number, things of that nature, really important to have on hand as backup information. Size standards that we discussed doesn't really apply to this group. Monthly payroll doesn't really apply as well. We'll be talking about the calculation and how you get to your loan amount later in this conversation. The purpose of the loan. I'll stop here, and I know Jamal touched on this a little bit, but I want to emphasize this for you. So the way in which you can spend the funds that you receive are 60% payroll, so in this case that'd be paying yourself, and 40% for other covered costs. So the other covered costs, that other 40%, are other business expenses that you see listed here. Rent and mortgage expenses, utilities, and as part of the new PPP program, an additional array of expenses that are now forgivable. Things like operations expenditures, property damage, supplier costs, and covered worker protection, which includes PPP costs. So there are more expansive lists of everything that falls into these categories available on the on the SBA's website. And again, we'll have links to that available to you. But this is really a wonderful addition to the program, that now you're able to use your PPP funds for these other business expenses that previously weren't covered. You'll want to be including any owners of 20% or more of the business. If that's anybody besides you, that comes into play here and implicates a variety of other considerations. And then we move into the question area. So these are these questions that can be straightforward, but you want to absolutely make sure you're answering them as accurately, in good faith as possible, and that you can back up your answers if backup information is required. Some of these questions really speak to eligibility beyond the initial level of eligibility that we had talked about before. So, for example, there are questions related to personal criminal history in a recent period, and that is possibly disqualifying, needs to be properly disclosed here in the application. Certain things related to the credit history and eligibility of the company. So walking through these questions, being very confident in your answers, absolutely essential here in the application. Let's move to the next slide, please. So one other aspect of eligibility, and I'm going to talk generally about some other pieces of eligibility that are important, and then also about what you're certifying to. First is that the business must have been in place, must have been in operation and existing before or on February 15, 2020. This is a program that's designed for existing businesses at the time the PPP was created. So that was in March of 2020. So this this timeline now, it can be applicable to many businesses that were formed during the pandemic. You're not, unfortunately, eligible for a PPP loan. Necessity. Generally, we think folks joining us today, small businesses like you in Philadelphia, will find these funds to be necessary. But in order to properly attest to that point, a business has to look at other options for funding, existing lending relationships, existing lines of credit, perhaps if there's been a history of individuals putting money into the business, looking at that as well. The idea here is that while the government wants these funds to be available to small businesses, they don't want these taxpayer dollars to be the first option for a business in need of funds. So as long as you've made a good faith consideration of what are other sources of liquidity, either they're not available or they're available on terms that are far too restrictive or detrimental to your business, then you can in good faith take these PPP funds. One additional aspect of the necessity consideration is, are the funds necessary? For most businesses, again, the funds will likely be necessary given what you've experienced during the pandemic. But the example we like to use is if for some reason you're a small business that, like Zoom, has been booming over the course of the pandemic and business is great, you don't qualify for this program. This is really for businesses who need the funding. In this certification at the back of the application, you're going to be certifying to that, not only that necessity piece, but also the use of funds, that you'll be using them for the proper way, the information you provided is correct, and that generally, your application is truthful. And Andrew's going to touch on this a little bit later, but this is a personal certification that you are making to the federal government. It carries significant potential penalties if the application that's made, if the certifications that are made are false. Now, we know when folks are filling these out, your small businesses looking for funds to support your business. And if in good faith you fill out this application and you make some sort of mistake, that's a mistake, and it can be remedied. But in no way should you state anything in this application that you know to be false, because it really does carry significant fraud risks, significant risks with the federal government that you don't want to touch. But as I said, to not end my portion on a scary note, these are funds that are available for businesses like you that are struggling during the pandemic. It's a fantastic federal program that can offer a lot of support, and we encourage you to work closely with your lender to make sure you fill out a great application in order to receive these funds. Let's move to the next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Scott to talk about some additional materials that you might need when connecting with a new lender. And then Scott's going to walk through some specific calculations to give you a really clear idea of how to determine how much funding you're eligible for.
Okay, great. Appreciate that transition, Ben. So just to give you guys a quick rundown, I'm going to talk about some of the materials that you'll need to apply for a PPP loan, but also when you are creating a relationship with a lender. Then I'm going to walk through the Schedule C IRS form that you'll need to have completed, and I'll dive into details on that. If you could all mute your selves, please. Thank you. And then after that, I will run through some specific examples to kind of show you how you might calculate a loan request amount for your own business on the application itself that Ben just walked through. So on this first page here, it's important to know in general, when you're creating a relationship with a lender, that they are mandated to kind of get to know you as a customer. And so you will need a lot of identifying documents, things like your business name, your address, other things like that. But it's really important to have at the ready your organizational documents for the business. So things like your organization chart and your formation documents. It's important for you to have those for your lender so that they can get to know you as a business and they know that you are who you say you are. So as I move on to this next slide, this is on the left side of the page is the Schedule C IRS form itself. You are going to need this form for your PPP application. And so to start off, on the right side of the page, you can see the top two links. The first link is the IRS form itself. The second link are detailed instructions that help you fill out every line item of this form. It's really important to look over those because they really help you walk through each item that you need to fill out. I'm going to run through kind of the broad steps of how to get through this, but I did want to address something on top of this because I know we've been getting a lot of questions in prior presentations as to if you have not yet filled out this Schedule C for 2020, how you can include it on your application itself. So the first point there is the borrower can choose whether they want to go off of 2019 numbers or 2020 numbers. So if you're going off of 2019 numbers, you obviously will not need your 2020 form, only your 2019. But if you do decide to go off of your 2020 numbers and you have not yet submitted the form to the IRS, you will have to complete this form and include it with your PPP application. Lenders and the SBA itself do require that you have this along with your application. So the key items that I'm going to run through here are part 1, which is income, part 2, which is expenses, and then those two numbers you will use to find your net profit, which is the number that then flows into the PPP application itself. So for part 1, you can see that your part 1 income number is made up of your gross receipts, things like your revenues, then your returns and allowances. And you can imagine if you are a clothing store and you have somebody return a purchase, that's what they're talking about there. And then your cost of goods sold, which is on page 2 of the form, which we don't have here, but the instructions run through if you keep inventory, how to calculate cost of goods sold for that. And they also give you an option if you are a business that does not keep inventory. So once you have those numbers, you will take the returns and allowances and the cost of goods sold, and you will subtract that from your gross receipts to get your gross profit number. Gross income is then calculated by taking that number that you just found and adding other income. And again, you can look at the instructions for this, but it's items such as a tax credit that would be included there. So once you have that number, you move down to part 2, expenses. And you can see on the form that there's a lot of different expenses here. There's advertising expenses, there's interest expenses, there's wages, there's utilities. The instructions themselves go through kind of what the form is calling out there for each line item. So you definitely want to take a look at that. But from a high level, you will take each of those items and you will add them up onto line item number 28, and that will give you your total expense number. So now that you have your part 1 income number and your part 2 expenses number, you can now figure out your net profit. So your tentative profit, as you see on the slide, is your gross income, and then you take your total expenses from line item number 28, subtract that from your gross income. And then just to get to your net profit, there is a section on the instructions that talk about expenses for business if you use your home for your business. And if that applies to you, you would take that out of the tentative profit number, and that will give you your net profit. Once you have this number, this is the number that flows into the PPP application that Ben discussed on the prior slides. And then you will apply the multiplier that 2.5x to that number after dividing it by 12 to get a monthly number. And that will give you, in general, your loan request amount. So I'm just going to run through quickly 2 different examples that might apply to you. And then if there are specific questions as to your businesses in particular, we can obviously address those in the question portion of the presentation. So on the left side, if you are a barbershop and you don't have any employees and you run this business yourself, and let's say at the end of the year, after you calculate your gross income numbers and your expense numbers, you end up with a $10,000 profit. That net profit number, that's the number. You'll then take that $10,000, you'll divide it by 12 to get a monthly number. That will leave you with about $833 in change. You'll then take that number and you'll multiply it by 2.5 to get your total loan request amount. That'll be just a bit above $2,000 for this example. The example on the other side of the slide is for a daycare. Let's say you have a daycare, and during the pandemic, obviously a lot of children were not in school and a lot of parents were at home. So let's say that these parents did not decide to send their children to daycare during the week or the weekends, and this business did not end up with a net profit. So just to reiterate, that would be their expenses amount from the Schedule C was more than their gross income amount from the Schedule C Part 1, and they did not have a net profit. If that number is negative, you do not qualify for a PPP loan. So this daycare here would not qualify for a PPP loan, but there are other small business loans through the SBA that are available to a business that does not hit a net profit. You just cannot apply specifically for the PPP. So I'm going to gloss over this slide just a bit because we'll probably come back to it during the Q&A, but this is the detailed calculation for employees without businesses. And you can refer back to this as you're completing that form. We took this directly from the SBA IFRs, so this is exactly what they're looking for when you're calculating your loan request amount. We also have the slide here for businesses with employees, if that applies to you. And again, you can refer back to this later if you need, because we will be sharing this PowerPoint with all of you. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Andrew to run over just a bit of the risks involved, and then we will move directly into the question portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Scott. So the risks with these loans, and as Ben mentioned, when you do apply for a Paycheck Protection Program loan, you are making factual certifications to the federal government, because ultimately, if you apply, receive a loan, and it is forgiven, that is a grant, or essentially it is government funds that have come from the government to you, and therefore the government requires the statements around your eligibility for these funds to be true and correct. The federal government is watching how these funds are spent. We already know from the experience with round 1 in 2020 that there were a number of applicants that either made up employees or made up businesses to try and take advantage of this program, and the criminal enforcement against those individuals was done swiftly and publicly. So there are oversight mechanisms. There's an inspector general of the Small Business Administration that has a team and resources, and other prosecutors that are looking at programs like this, because whenever there are large government funding programs, they do tend to come with some degree of fraud, and they are on the lookout for these things. I think the takeaway here for a small business like yourself is just, make sure you are comfortable and with your factual statements and that they are true, and make sure you look at the things we've talked about today and make sure that they really are true, and you're comfortable making them. If you can do that, then likely you won't have any issues with this area of risk. Next slide. Okay, question and answers. So thanks to everyone for submitting your questions in the chat throughout the session. My colleague Ben is going to walk us through those, and then we as a group are going to try and answer specific questions or focus on specific areas of concern, so we can provide a little more granular understanding of the areas that you have questions on. Ben, please step us through those, and let's do that now.
Thanks, Andrew. So everybody, it looks like we've got about 20 minutes left in the presentation. We'll run till 2:15. And during that time, we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible. Really want to thank the Enterprise Centers team for responding to questions that they've come into the chat. I'm going to touch on 2 topics I've seen come up in multiple places. And kind of give an overview of those topics. And then if your question has not been responded to, please go ahead and repost it in the chat. We'll start looking for questions that came in after 155, 156, and make sure you post that to everybody so the full chat is visible, and then we'll walk through those as well. So the first topic I want to talk about is other programs available. So if you're not eligible for the PPP, or you're exploring additional programs, we thought it'd be good to just touch for a second on what else is available through the SBA and through these federal programs. Some to highlight for you, the microloan program through the SBA, that is a great option for a small business that might not be eligible for the PPP. Traditional 7A loans, which is the loan program on which the PPP is built. That's another loan program to take a look at. There's information on both of those on the SBA's website. So that's a great thing to look into to see, hey, maybe there's some additional or alternative loan programs I'll look at. Also, the EIDL loans, those are emergency disaster loans. We've seen some questions here related to them specifically, and I'll note that those are loans that cannot be used for the same purposes. You can't get money from the federal government from two different programs for exactly the same expense, but they can complement each other, and you can refinance an EIDL loan into your PPP loan. Additionally, the grant that comes with the EIDL loan is no longer reduced, no longer creates a reduction against your forgiveness from the PPP program. So really great opportunity to try to leverage both of those together. So that's just to give you a perspective on, there are additional programs out there. We think by far PPP is the strongest in terms of that full forgiveness opportunity and the amount of funds. But if you're ineligible or you just want to look at what else might be possible, talk to your lender, look at the SBA's website, consider some of those programs. The other topic I'll hit on before I kick to my colleagues for some of the questions that come in is categorically ineligible businesses. There were a few questions that came about, well, what is that list of businesses that Ben mentioned that are categorically ineligible? I'll walk through some of them just to give you a picture. This is not exhaustive, but it gives a little more detail. So first is real estate investment businesses. So if a business is purchasing real estate, holding the real estate, getting income off of rent from the real estate, that business is not eligible for a PPP SBA loan. It's one of the classic ineligible SBA businesses. Dealers of rare coins and stamps are not eligible. Firms involved in lending activities are not eligible. Pyramid sales plans, such as cosmetic or household goods, et cetera, they are not eligible. If you're involved in illegal activities, you're certainly not eligible. And any firms involved in gambling activities or something similar are also not eligible. So I thought I'd hit on a couple of those just in case it's applicable to any folks. The real estate one is one that tends to be unfortunate for a lot of small business owners who are primarily focused on owning and receiving profits from real estate holdings. That is an ineligible category here. So if I scroll back through questions, one thing that I think we'd like to do based on the questions that came earlier and just kind of the general focus of the presentation is to show up close some of the calculations that relate specifically to how you get to your loan number. So I think I'll kick it over to Scott and ask him to move to some of the slides later in the presentation that show you precisely how do you get to what's the loan amount you're going to be eligible for here.
Sure. So let me just grab the slides here and get them over to the right one. So I think this is probably what you're referring to here. So this is just kind of a detailed example of what I was going through, for instance, with the barbershop example or a business like that. If you're a business without employees and you need to kind of calculate your Schedule C, Part 1 income, Part 2 expenses, and then you get your net profit number, and let's say that net profit number was $10,000, or if it was a different number, you can apply the same kind of approach here. You then take that $10,000, as you see, you divide it by 12 to get your monthly amount. You then apply the 2.5x multiplier to that, and that will be your loan request amount. Just to clarify there, step 4 is if you had received an EIDL during a specified period, I believe it's between January and April, the application itself notes the specific timing, but that will then be added as well. But as Ben noted, you don't need to pay back your EIDL advance anymore. So that does not need to be included in there. And I guess one other thing I would emphasize here again is if that line item for net profit turns out to be negative or zero, you can see that if you move through the calculation and you try to divide by 12, and then if you take that number and you multiply by 2.5, you're not going to end up with a loan request amount. And that's just kind of the way the program was designed, that if you are not net profitable, you will not be eligible for the PPP loan. And that's again where kind of those other programs that Ben had mentioned can come in, because there are still options for you. It's just the PPP loan itself does not apply. The one other item that I would mention, and I saw some questions on this, was for the multiplier of 2.5. If you're taking out a second draw loan, so not a first time, you've already received a first time loan, and you are taking out a second loan if you are eligible for a second draw, and we can kind of run through what those requirements are quickly, but the multiplier is still going to be a 2.5. But if you are part of a accommodations or food services business, that multiplier has been carved out for those businesses, and you can use a 3.5x multiplier. If you want, Ben or Andrew, I can move to those slides and we could walk through those quickly, or do you want to move on to other questions?
You can go through those, Scott. That's not a bad idea.
Okay. I'm actually going to let Jamal talk to this.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So again, so these just highlight some details with respect to those who are applying for second draw loans. Again, not applicable here, but it's relevant for employees that are, the threshold here is 300 versus 500 for first-time employers. First-time draw loans. And then as Scott mentioned before, the food services and accommodations businesses, those are eligible for to receive loans that are 3.5 times the monthly payroll. But we know here that, again, you must have used or plan to use the full amount of the original PPP loan. And you also must demonstrate at least a 25% reduction in revenue, on a quarterly basis, but that can also be calculated on an annual basis. So you can calculate it if you've had a 25% reduction in revenue annually, calculated based on 2020 versus 2019 as well, rather than quarterly. Another slide in there, Scott, that covers. Yeah,
there's just one more here.
Okay, and again, we note that the maximum here is $2 million for the second draw loans versus $10 million. And again, we note that it's at 2.5 times threshold for the average monthly payroll costs, for businesses other than accommodation and food services industries, in which you could receive 3.5 times the average monthly payroll.
Great, thanks to both of you. I'm going to add one clarification in response to a question to what I previously said about real estate holding companies. It is good to note that if your business is primarily a real estate management operation, so you might hold real estate and receive income from the real estate, but you also manage the properties, it's very possible you can be eligible. What the SBA is carving out is businesses that passively hold investments or speculate or things of that nature. Okay, let's see if we have other questions coming in here. Scott, maybe do you want to speak to exactly how, again, we get to that? What is my loan amount? So if we start with the net profit slide and maybe run through that once more, just to give people a very clear picture of what is my loan amount here, because we're still getting a couple questions on that point.
Sure. So you mean
Scott, too, maybe also just address when you would use net profit versus when you would use average monthly payroll costs.
Got it. So again, I'll turn back to the slide here that kind of has the example calculations. So on the left side, this is the stuff that you will be doing for your Schedule C. And we saw a lot of questions come in about what if you haven't completed that form yet? What do you do? You do have to include a Schedule C completed form with your application. It is required by lenders and by the SBA for the PPP loans. And again, you can choose as the borrower if you want to use 2019 numbers or 2020 numbers. And if you are using 2020 numbers and you have not yet completed your Schedule C, you will have to complete that along with your PPP application. So there's two key parts for the Schedule C. Again, part one is income, part two is expenses. Part one income is really just three main items. It's going to be your gross receipts, which is essentially your revenues. Then your returns and allowances and your cost of goods sold are both going to be taken out of that gross receipts number to get to your gross income number. As you can see there, the 450 minus the 20 minus the 280 gets you to 150 for your gross income. Then your expenses, this is just an example of the line items on the part two expenses. So advertising, if you pay mortgage as part of a loan that you took out for the business, if you have incidental repairs or maintenance throughout the year, again, that's not to improve the property. It's just for things that happen incidentally to kind of repair the property. And a couple of additional expenses there. Again, you will add those expenses up and you will get kind of a total expense value. And you see on the slide there, that's that $140,000. You'll take that from your part one income. That will get you your net profit, assuming that you are profitable, because again, if you are not profitable, you will not be eligible for a PPP loan. If you are profitable, you then take that net profit number, divide it by 12 to get your monthly number, and then you will apply that 2.5x to get your loan request amount. And then if you were a business that had an EIDL as well, then you will add that number in, but do not include the advance amount because, as Ben had mentioned, you do not have to repay that, and that will be your loan request amount. And then I think the other question to address was kind of when you use the net profit number versus when you use the average payroll number. The distinction here is if you have self-employment income and you file the Schedule C, that's when you will be using your net profit number. If you are perhaps more of a traditional business that has a payroll and you do not file a Schedule C, that's when you will be using the payroll numbers. Hopefully that addressed that question.
That's great. Thank you, Scott.
Yep.
Couple other points that we'll hit on in here. There were great questions coming in through the chat. The personal credit of the borrower is not a factor here. There are no credit checks for PPP, so that's certainly important to keep in mind. There's a question from Swazi Properties. I have a cafe that is not open now because of COVID. We were only open for a year on and off. Can we apply? It's a question of what is the business permanently shuttered? If it is, then you can't apply. Did the business have employees on payroll from which you can develop an amount eligible for the application, or net profits if it's just sole owned? That's the other factor there. And was it created before February 15, 2020? Needs to have been in existence before then, in operation before then. So that's another factor. Quickly to just reiterate what Jamal focused on with the second draw application, if you've already received a PPP. So for your second draw application, you will need to demonstrate a 25% reduction in revenue quarter to quarter, so Q1 2020 versus Q1 2019 or something similar. Or if you can't demonstrate it quarter to quarter, you can use an overall year-to-year decline of 25% to demonstrate your eligibility. Now, at the time of your application, you do not need to show proof of that decline if your loan is under $150,000. You will need to eventually, so you should have that proof ready. But if, for example, you know there was the decline, your books just aren't in order, or your accountant doesn't have them prepared, you can still make your application now, get those funds, and then submit that evidence along with your forgiveness application.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification point on that. When you say quarter to quarter, we mean year over year. So that would be quarter 2 of 2020 versus quarter 2 of 2019. It's not quarter 2 2020 to quarter 3 2020. Just wanted to make that clarification.
That's an important clarification. Yeah, thanks for noting that, Scott. It is looking at the 2 years, Q1 versus Q1 of both of those years. Yes, very, very important. So it seems like questions running in. We've kind of hit on a number of these, but I'll note, yes, sole owners of LLCs still potentially eligible to qualify. That brings us pretty near the end of our time. I think we've hit on the bulk of the questions that have come in. We really thank you for providing those questions, for engaging with us here. We'll note that the Enterprise Center has incredible resources as you seek to apply for the PPP. We at Morgan Lewis will be providing additional information through the Enterprise Center as the program develops. So please do remain in touch, and we look forward to helping you through this process. I'll pass things back over to the Enterprise Center.
Thank you, Ben and the Morgan Lewis team. For more information and resources, visit the enterprisecenter.com website. We wish you all the best in your loan application process. Thank you for joining us.